Many people don't know but are often pondering the question, when am I going to die? The truth is, we will probably never truly know, but I know when Intel's gonna die, and it's gonna be at the end of next year because I'm super duper excited to see how Apple completes this entire transition, and now that we've had two of probably the most important Macs transition over to Apple Silicon, it gives us a better idea of what's to come in the future. Let's begin. So first of all, I think it's amazing that we can finally say Apple doesn't put Intel in any of their laptops now. Like, I've been wanting to say that all year. Every single laptop Apple sells is now powered by Apple Silicon. The only Intel left in the Mac lineup is now restricted to desktops. We've got three of the unholy trinity left to get rid of, which is, for one, the Intel 27-inch iMac alongside the Intel Mac Mini that is still space gray, but has 4 Thunderbolt ports. I'm now realizing that's one of the few Macs that has 4 Thunderbolt ports other than the Mac Pro. Wow, that's weird. But of course, then the Mac Pro, which hasn't been really updated or changed since 2019, that is still there and left to be transitioned. And I think once the Mac Pro officially gets Apple Silicon, it's going to be mind-boggling what that graph looks like for Apple, because we're seeing them now have incredibly high GPU and CPU performance at very, very low power consumption. But the question remains, what happens with Apple Silicon when you don't have to restrict it to prioritizing battery life, or restrict it to saying, let's have it consume far less power because it's a Mac Pro, right? We have full access to a 110 outlet and you can basically use as much as you want. No one's gonna care. It's a tower. But because the first part of Bloomberg's report ended up being true, you know, they were correct about the M1 Pro and M1 Max having 8 high performance cores, 2 efficiency cores, and then an optional 16 core GPU on the M1 Pro, 32 core GPU on the M1 Max. That means it's fairly likely for us to assume that the Apple Silicon Mac Pro will also be correct from Bloomberg's report, which means 4 M1 Max chips basically combined and stitched together. Apple may have a brand new name for this, whether it's going to be M1 Ultra or M1 Super Mega Suduper Flooper chip. I don't know, but it's certainly going to be in a class of its own. And to give you some perspective, Bloomberg said the options for the new Mac Pro would probably go between 64 core GPU, so take an M1X, double it, and that's one of the tiers, and then there would also be an optional 128 core GPU, which means, yes, taking basically the power of the M1X, multiplying it by 4, and putting that into a single machine. I do expect it to be more expensive, though. That's just inevitable as we're seeing the prices of the MacBook Pros go up, and I don't think it's all just because of mini LED. That's likely part of it, but it's just kind of mind-boggling to imagine what kind of computational power you're going to have in a machine like that. It will probably still start around $5,000 or $6,000. I think I'm expecting that, but I don't think the Apple Silicon Mac Pro will need to go all the way up to $50,000 anymore like it does now. I think that's mostly because of AMD and Intel and all of the components Apple has to buy for those computers, but once everything is integrated and it's all a system on chip, that will probably cost less than $50,000 for a maxed out version of the Mac Pro, but still expect it to be north of $10,000. I think that's fair and safe to assume. But of course, no one really is gonna buy that Mac Pro except a handful of YouTubers, so let's talk about something a lot of you I know are super duper interested in. The 2 Intel Macs that are still floating around on the site, the Intel Mac Mini, which we were really not thinking would make it into next year, and of course the 27-inch iMac. The good news is Ross Young actually dropped some information on the upcoming Apple Silicon iMac last night and suggested that it'll be a 27-inch display, which honestly caught me a tad off guard. I was expecting, you know, just like the 21.5-inch is now 24 inches, maybe 27 would get a size increase, but maybe they're keeping that the same. But he did say to expect this new iMac in the first quarter of next year. Typically, Apple doesn't release much in January or February, so when he says Q1 2022, I take that as March, because Apple's had March events in the past, and there's likely to be one next year, unless they're feeling inspired and want to have another 420 event like they did in 2021. That was epic. Great job picking the dates, Tim. But that means not too far away, like within the next 6 months, we should be looking at the redesigned, updated version of the iMac, which Ross Young is a display supply chain analyst who's been proven very accurate in most recent history, and he's saying this updated iMac will have mini LED, which makes sense. The iPads, the MacBooks are getting it. Why wouldn't the Pro and and iMac get it. And also ProMotion, in other words, 120 hertz display, which sounds awesome, but few things he did not give us information on. He did not say if it would have a notch, so this might be the type of monitor where, because it's 16:9, you don't necessarily want to just use the excuse of, a notch will just be hidden in the menu bar, because when you're watching 16:9 content on an iMac, that takes advantage of every single pixel, so a notch would be more likely to intrude on your video content. And on top of that, when you're working with a 27-inch display, you know, you probably don't need to use bezels as thin as the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, where like a notch is necessary for the camera cutouts. Also, on the MacBook Pros, they have very, very thin display lids that they have to stuff all those cameras into, whereas with an iMac, you've got 11 millimeters of thickness to work with. Even on the 24-inch iMac, which is the thinnest iMac ever, but it's still like basically twice the thickness of an iPad Pro, which has center stage and Face ID, so no word on the biometrics of this next generation iMac, but I think given how Apple is branding all of their new Apple Silicon Macs, it makes sense that this new iMac coming next year, probably around the March timeframe, so not too long to go, they might as well brand it iMac Pro, you know, because they didn't update both sized iMacs at the same time, and very, very likely that this upgraded iMac is going to be rocking pretty much the same silicon that we saw in the MacBook Pros. It's somewhat of a similar repeat of what happened with the M1 chip last year. We got our two MacBooks, and then the same silicon found their way into the entry-level iMac at the beginning of 2021. So now we're getting two MacBooks with the M1 Pro and M1 Max chip, and then a few more months go by, and then those same chips find their way into an iMac. So I'm anticipating iMac Pro with M1 Max compatibility, and of course the M1 Pro will be on the base storage option, but given it's 120 hertz and mini LED, and this will likely be a redesign with thinner bezels, I'm guessing it'll still have a chin, but who knows, they might go with the black border this time due to the backlash from the 24-inch iMac, and just brand it as a Pro machine because it's got extreme dynamic range, it's got high refresh rate, and it's got a CPU and GPU far more powerful than the M1 chip. That just sounds the most logical to me, so I'm kind of filling in the gaps for a lot of rumors and stuff. I don't think that the next generation iMac would get the insane CPU and GPU options that the Mac Pro is getting, because this new iMac is rumored to launch fairly early in 2022, whereas the Mac Pro, that's something I could easily see being unveiled at Quadruple UDC next year, and then doesn't even ship until like October or November, very, very late in the transition cycle. But understandably so, because this Mac Pro has got to be, you know, fundamentally redesigned from the ground up, and it's going to need a lot of very, very powerful silicon all working in conjunction with each other. So Mac Pro, probably safe to assume, will be last, but I'm sure a lot of you are also still wondering, what about the Mac Mini? I know a lot of you were saving up money for this Mac because we were hearing about the idea of essentially the M1 Pro or the M1 Max chip being available in a cheaper Mac that, okay, it's not as crazy expensive as a Mac Pro, but you want the performance that these new MacBook Pros got in a cheaper model. I actually think this one is going to take longer than we expect. Originally, I would have thought we were going to get a refreshed Mac Mini by the end of this year, but Randy from the Tailosive Tech podcast brought up an amazing point in our last show, which I have to agree with, and that is an M1 Pro in a Mac Mini would actually kind of butcher the sales of potentially the iMac Pro and the 24-inch iMac, because once you start realizing that for either $1,200 or for $1,500, you could buy a Mac with way better CPU and GPU performance than the 24-inch iMac, then people would go, well, why the heck would I buy that iMac? I'm just going to get a Mac Mini and connect it to my cheapo $200 monitor or buy a Amazon Basics keyboard and mouse, but I'll still have the great performance of the Mac Mini and I'll still be running Mac OS, so why bother with a 24-inch iMac, or why bother with the iMac Pro? And because of how it might cannibalize sales, you know, I don't think it's a technical limitation. I don't think they're not doing the M1 Pro Mac Mini just because, we couldn't find a way to stuff that processor in there. Like, they totally could. It might have something to do with the chip shortage, you know, TSMC manufacturing as many chips as they can, and Apple's prioritizing the MacBook Pros because those cost a lot more, so the margins on those Macs are probably a lot better than they would be on a Mac Mini. But I also think it's totally believable that Apple doesn't want to make the M1 Pro too affordable, otherwise people will stop buying iMacs, so they're gonna start with the iMac Pro at the beginning of next year, and then I'm not saying they'll never do an M1 Pro version of the Mac Mini, I just think that they basically want to do it last so that they've captured all of your sales for the iMac and the iMac Pro and the MacBook Pros. Like, they've got your money, and then when everything else has been dropped, maybe they'll introduce an M1 Pro version of the Mac Mini at the same time they drop the Apple Silicon Mac Pro, so people will be kind of like, like, oh, okay, here's your tower versions of the Mac, and now the most powerful Apple Silicon, you know, M1 Pro and M1 Max are now available in a very, very cheap Mac. But it won't have mattered because we've already bought our iMacs and MacBooks, so Apple's gotten most of our money. So by the end of next year, Intel should be completely wiped off from Apple's website, but we should be looking at a pretty astounding deal on the new 27-inch iMac. I'm very curious if they're going to take it in a different design direction, because as you guys know, I'm a huge fan of all-in-ones, and I would love to see what an iMac looks like with one size bezel all the way around, but everyone's like, no, it won't be iconic enough, right? Also, in the meantime, I would also really appreciate it if Apple made a standalone mini LED 27-inch monitor with ProMotion that could kind of replace the Pro Display XDR, even if it is a tad smaller, but Ross Young is saying that that might happen later in the year. Don't expect it to happen in March. But this is probably the most interesting part in the transition, because there's still a lot we don't know, but we're finally seeing the actual performance metrics that Apple is capable of with their next generation silicon, now going into Pro devices, no longer going into entry-level models. So it's an exciting time to be a Mac fan, unless you're a MacBook Air. There's no fans in that. But feel free to let me know what you guys think the rollout of Apple Silicon next year is going to look like down below. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Unless I die, because I don't know when that's gonna happen. Bye!